Good morning and welcome to another episode of CIO Leadership Live. I'm Mary Fran Johnson, Executive Director of CIO Programs for IDG. Joining me today from his office in Dearborn, Michigan, is John Hill, the Chief Information Officer at Carhartt Incorporated, a premium workwear brand that makes rugged apparel for men, women, and children. This is a retailer founded in 1889 and still today run by the Carhartt family. The CEO is the great-grandson of the founder Hamilton Carhartt, and members of the fifth generation of the family, many of them still work at the company. In fact, one of them is a member of the analytics team in IT. John joined Carhartt as the CIO 2 years ago after serving as VP of Solutions Delivery at Grainger, a $10 billion distributor of industrial products. A former U.S. Air Force officer, John's experience spans several industries. He has worked in automotive, pharmaceuticals, biotech, software as a service, insurance, and government, and now most recently, rugged retail. He found his way into IT from the business sourcing and supply chain sides of companies such as IBM, General Motors, and Roche. John, welcome. It's great to have you here today. Before we get into some of your top priorities at Carhartt, which we'll be talking about, I wanted to talk a little bit about your IT and business experience across all these different industries. And one of the things we'll start with is why I've heard you call yourself an accidental CIO. So how did that happen?
Well, yeah, as you mentioned, I've been in a number of different industries, and my career after I left the Air Force was, started in the global sourcing business at IBM just after Gerstner joined. And I was responsible for a lot of the big relationships that IBM had with companies like Cisco or HP to support its kind of emerging global services business. And from there, it just kind of, I would say, meandered. Even when I was at IBM, I built, our first intranet site in Notepad for the procurement division, and just like I said, I found myself, taking on more and more IT type of things, and as I moved on in my career, I did a startup out in California at the height of the .com era, so. Got to spend a lot of time with industry folks, and then I'd say after I got to Roche and it was clear, I have the opportunity to become a CIO in the future. And I think that business experience, having done supply chain business development, helped me to be able to operate with the other senior executives and be able to talk maybe a different language to them. And on top of that, I was used to being the receiver of IT services. So I think I had a unique perspective in terms of what I liked and what I didn't like when I was on the the other side of the equation, so to speak.
Well, that's great. How when you're about to dive into a new industry, how do you learn about it? You've been through 5 or 6 different ones. Do you have a special immersion therapy you put yourself through? Or, your last one, you went from industrial products into retail, which probably couldn't be more different.
Yeah, at the heart of it, I like to say that, a lot of the core business of an industry are kind of similar. Everybody's got to, make a product, sell a product of some kind. But if you look at the way I even approach my daily life, the first thing I do every morning is read the Wall Street Journal. And I think that's helped me to have a kind of a broad understanding of industry. And as I looked at opportunities like Carhartt, I did a lot of research in advance, a lot of industry research, read analysts, in this case, I couldn't read necessarily the company annual reports, but I read all of the competitors' annual reports. So I spent a lot of time learning about the industry before I get there. And then once I get in the company, I spend a lot of time, really on the ground in the different business functions. So here, spending time in our factories, with the sewing operators, in our distribution center, working to understand, what's happening on the goods to person station, for example, going out on sales calls with reps to understand what our customers think of us, spending time with the marketing team or spending time with the product development team. That's really the only way you can really learn the industry is spending time with the folks and ask a lot of questions. It's it's really helpful sometimes to be that new person because you have a completely unjaded view as to how things work. And so far it's worked well for me, and I've been lucky that everywhere I've been, I've had a good team that works with me that helps me learn that industry as fast as I can.
Yeah. Well, and I was interested too. One of the articles I read that you had been interviewed for, you were talking about your interview process with the executives at Carhartt, and you made the rounds of all the different executives, and you had specific questions that you asked them. What were those like?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them were, the normal. I say the normal. I think everybody would ask this, but what's their key business challenges?
Oh, sure.
What are they looking for from a CIO? But similarly, I'd ask them, how do they work with one another in the company? What are the challenges they see as an executive leadership team in working together? What do they see in terms of competitor threats? And what I'm usually doing is looking to see if there's consistency across that executive leadership team.
Yeah.
It's a telling point if there's not consistency in terms of whether it's the internal viewpoints of how things get done or how the company's positioned in the marketplace. And I say at Carhartt, I was lucky that we have a fantastic senior executive leadership team and very aligned. We don't really have a lot of the I'd say some of the challenges you see at maybe some of the bigger companies.
Yeah. Well, which you had just come from. Carhartt is probably 6 or 7 times larger than, of course, this is an editor doing math, so we should never do that. But it's so much bigger than Carhartt. And so the scope and the size was a change for you. You must have heard things when they talked about the company culture that were just a real attraction to you. And what was that?
Well, I mean, you mentioned a little bit about, Carhartt's legacy, 1889, family owned, and you look at our mission, which is to build rugged products to serve and protect hardworking people. Both my family and my wife's family have roots, in blue collar jobs. And so both the brand and the culture were just a fantastic fit for me personally.
Yeah.
If you add in the challenge from a business perspective to help Carhartt digitize and better serve those hardworking people, then it was a no-brainer for me. I really wasn't concerned as I looked at what the next opportunity for me about the size of the company or the prestige of the company. Culture and fit was the number one criteria for myself as I did the evaluation.
Okay. Well, and that's a very good segue to my next question, which they picked you when you got there. And what were your marching orders? You've been there now, it's a full 2 years.
Right.
And usually the president and the board have something in mind when they're bringing in a new CIO. So what was that for you?
I think there were probably 3 different things, and it depended on which level you were at. If you think from a president perspective, her most important thing was leadership. Providing leadership to the organization, helping to develop people, to get the output from the talent that was in the organization. And really, it's a very talented IT organization, top to bottom. And so for her, that was the number one thing. I think I had 3 interviews with her, and every time it was, let's keep talking about leadership. How do you approach this? So that was her number one point. And knowing that if we can take care of that, it takes care of a lot of the other challenges that any IT organization, or any organization for that matter, has to work through. If you then talk about the rest of the senior executive peers, theirs would have been 2 items. One was time to market, and the other one would be innovation or trying new things. They had never done any cloud activity. And time to market, for example, the time between the last build on the website and the one that just happened as I was doing the interviews was 4 months. So there wasn't a real time to market
a sense of urgency.
Focus. Yeah. So those were the 2 from their perspective. And if you look at what we did on time to market, for example, I'd say probably 2 key things that we did. One was implement agile, lean agile, and the other was create capacity in the organization. So Let's talk about the harder one first. Creating capacity.
I was just about to ask you about that.
They didn't. Not like they said, "Here's a blank check. Go spend money."
Mm-hmm.
So we needed to figure out how we could, create that capacity in the organization to do more projects. What we saw is that we hired a lot of contractors in to do projects,
Mm-hmm.
and our internal staff worked on maintenance and support. The problem with that was you had a pretty significant learning curve every time somebody came in.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't have the internal people that were necessarily available to work with those consultants. And so you looked at that ability to do a lot of projects as a challenge. So what we did is we decided to outsource all of the application maintenance and testing.
You essentially flipped the model then, didn't you?
Right.
Yeah.
And then I could capitalize internal folks, which I was capitalizing the consultants. I could capitalize the internal folks and basically stay budget neutral.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition, we didn't have to lay off a single person as part of that outsourcing of the application maintenance and testing. And if you look at that, the transition was absolutely flawless because nobody was worried about their job. Not a single knowledge management session was missed during that transition.
Mm-hmm.
And IBM, who's our partner and took over it, if you'd ask them, they said it was one of the best transitions they had. We actually put a project manager in on our side to manage it from our perspective. I think a lot of companies just use the suppliers, but we had one on our side to drive it. And so that became not only a way to free up my team, but it also meant that I had a go-to partner for projects in. They knew our landscape, they understood, so they could quickly come in and jump into projects and be ready to go. So we saw about a 30% bump in capacity just by doing the flip of that model.
Yeah.
The other thing then we did was the lean agile. And Carhartt was a classic waterfall. Organization. The challenge is they focused on, kind of, we're going to take the whole program, we're going to write it all down and spend 6 months on writing up the requirements, and we'll deliver it over 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened is that meant that only one or two things could get done because of these type of efforts.
Yeah.
So we put in the lean agile, probably heavier Kanban than Scrum.
Mm-hmm.
And our big focus was on minimum viable products. Break things down into very small chunks of realizable business value.
Right.
And so we could do a lot of projects at the same time because the teams were focused on delivering those in short cycles. And we weren't crowding out a lot of activity.
Mm-hmm.
As a result, we deploy new functionality not only to the website but even our ERP environment every 2 weeks.
Yeah. And John, when you said Kanban rather than Scrum, what's the layman's description of the difference between the two of those?
So if you think about Kanban, for those that are familiar with manufacturing, Kanban is a way of visualizing work in progress. And in manufacturing, use it to understand where are your choke points in your organization. Mm-hmm. If you think about think about a water pipe. And if you had a pipe that was this big, and then you had a little pipe and then a big pipe, the flow to the last part of the pipe is only the size of that middle pipe. Mm-hmm. And so what I've done in a few places is you realize that knowledge workers have the same challenge. If you throw too much work towards them, it actually reduces their effectiveness. Mm-hmm. And frankly, you misunderstand where those choke points are in the organization. So we use the story process from Agile, and we merge that then with Kanban to limit our work in progress. Okay. And understand where that is across the organization, not just in the development teams, but all the way through to whether it's security or infrastructure or the architecture teams. Mm-hmm. We do have Scrum, which is that traditional agile teams structure, but I would say we're a heavier Kanban.
Okay.
structure.
Well, I always think it's fascinating, the whole process of moving not just an IT organization but an entire company to that agile approaches, to that different way of thinking. I think a lot of times it becomes a little bit of a shock on the business side when they realized how much they need to be involved, how many meetings they have to be in, how there has to be a product manager, how fast things are moving. I mean, they can't just sit back and say, well, you guys take care of that over in IT. How was it introduced into Carhartt? Did you end up bringing in like outside coaches or trainers, or you had obviously worked in that environment before? So how did you approach it?
I focused first internally in the IT organization, and I actually did the training myself. So
really?
I did. I led an introduction to Lean Agile for the entire organization to teach them how it works. And then really the approach was go experiment, go try stuff. I think a lot of times people think there's a blueprint for this, but what works in one organization doesn't work in another. And I've done this in 4 different organizations, and I can say, well, without any doubt, that all 4 implementations are quite different than the others. And really it's that experimentation. Go try it, go see what happens. Nothing's gonna break because you're trying this. So we did that internally first. And then we started to find champions then within the organization who could then train others on what did they learn, what's working well for themselves. And then we picked some key business unit to say, listen, we need a product owner from you now. Now we're ready. You start writing the stories, you start prioritizing. And for us, we picked our e-commerce business as the best example to do that first. But now we've rolled that out across the organization. Even if you look at the traditional SAP environment, we've got the product owners from finance or HR or supply chain that are providing that product ownership.
Okay. Now, is the intent to eventually, or perhaps you're there already, get to essentially 100% agile in approach, or do you think there'll always be somewhat of a balance between the two?
We don't have waterfall anymore.
Okay.
There's no waterfall. It is all, I'd say, that lean agile
Excellent
approach.
Well, and some of the things we talked about, some of the projects and the things that got accomplished in your first year, where your first 2 years, an ERP implementation, Office 365 rolled out, Salesforce, the IBM sourcing change, the new website, the Lean Agile moves, and a new warehousing system. Now, you're doing this with an IT staff of about 115 people?
That's correct. Plus we have the IBM team in India.
Yeah. Okay. Of all those, that's a lot of projects, of course, to have in the air, especially the first year. When you look back, is there anything you do differently about it?
There's I'd say one thing. I mean, like you said, we did a lot. And in fact, there's even others. I was surprised as I got ready for this interview to kind of look back at the last 2 years in terms of just the sheer scope and the number of systems that have been done. The one thing I would say that I've done differently is the Office 365 implementation. Okay. We took a decision to go very fast, to get everybody on the platform as quickly as possible, so that we had everybody start to use the same tools. And we could have done it like a very deep approach with each function, and then rolled it. Our fear was, or was probably mine, my team was, I would safely say we're not completely on board with that go fast approach. But the fear was that some teams would start to complain that the other teams couldn't work with them, on the key tools that they had. And so I think what we needed to do, though, was to provide a different level of education than we did. We did the basic education. What we needed to do is we got them on really fast. We should have deployed people to sit down with each of the business units and talk about their business processes a little bit more and understand how can we really tailor that to their business processes. Now, we ended up doing that, it was probably 9 months after implementation, but I think it would have been a little smoother if we had done that.
Okay.
Now everybody's very
Fair enough.
happy.
Yeah.
Everybody's very happy with the implementation, and we got it done very fast.
Well, no, I've talked with some businesses where they were making a move to Office 365 and they were coming off Lotus Notes. And did you remember Lotus Notes? And they tended to have a lot of positive feedback because they were going from kind of a Stone Age approach to this. But it is a very complex piece of software. So, it's not as, people think it's just what you see on your desktop, and it's a lot more. Now, in addition to your CIO duties and what you do on the IT side of your job, you've also added other business functions since you got there. Planning, pricing, supply chain planning, I guess it is. Talk about how that came about. That was not part of the initial discussions when you came in?
Okay. It really came up just because we decided to add a focus on a different line of business, which was our industrial business, our business-to-business space. And so an executive that was responsible for those functions, we said, okay, you're going to take responsibility now for leading this effort. So my boss then, of course, comes and says, hey, can you pick up these other activities? And I always consider myself first and foremost to be a member of the senior executive team, not the CIO. So for me, it was no big deal. I have a great leadership team in place on the IT side. I've been able to put in, a fabulous group top to bottom, and they're able to run their pieces of the business, and they work really well together. If you think, the one thing I've done with that team is I use a heavy reliance on shared goals across that leadership team. And what I mean by that is we may take a goal, which is all the projects, for example, and everybody on the leadership team has the exact same goal. We'll have a goal related to what we're going to do, even on related to protecting the brand or getting more effective. Every one of the team members has the exact same goal. And that's so that everybody's lined up. If there's something not going the right direction, I don't have to jump in and say, go fix this. They're all lined up and their compensation's lined up to say, we either get there as a team or we don't get there. So that really freed me up to be able to spend the time on other tasks as well.
Okay. Well, and you also made the point that you are pretty vocal in the leadership meetings in every aspect, and that you don't just restrict yourself to IT topics.
Right. I think for most people, I've talked to a fair number, and you, of course, talk to thousands of CIOs, and I
probably over the last several years, that could be true.
And I think that there's really two ways of looking at your role on a leadership team. There's either I'm the CIO and I'm representing IT in the leadership team, or I'm a member of the leadership team and I am helping to run, the company as a whole. Yeah. I choose the latter in terms of the approach. And that means that I'm expected to contribute. It doesn't matter if we're having a discussion about our distribution strategy in terms of who we're selling to, our supply chain strategy, our marketing strategy. I'm expected to contribute and I make sure that I'm prepared to have those conversations at the leadership team meetings.
Well, from what I've seen with the CIOs, we do 10 events a year, so we see a lot of CIOs there. And of course, we talk to them a lot in the course of our own work here. But it seems that in the last, I'd say 2 to 3 years, the expectation from other business executives about what IT is going to contribute has really grown. It has changed. I mean, there's now, the Wall Street Journal has an entire section, CIO Journal, that it deals with all of the issues around IT in the business and that sort of thing. And it seems like the expectation has changed a lot. Have you seen that in your own career progression?
Yeah, I think let's say this, the companies that are going to be successful in the future have definitely embraced that.
Yes.
That, you can't, there's no business process. There's nothing that's going to get delivered today in today's world without technology as a key part of it. So I think that any company who understands then that you need the CIO to play a more strategic role in working with the business units to help shape that. There are a fair number of companies out there, and I've talked to peers who aren't necessarily treated, that way. But my experience at Carhartt is, that's the expectation, and we just expect that when we're talking about this, we're having strategic discussions. We expect the CIO, or if it's one of my direct reports, to be able to contribute to that discussion.
Right. Okay.
It's definitely changed though. If you look at, if I jump back even to my time at Roche. And it's definitely changed a lot over that time.
Well, and it kind of has to, because if you've got a lot of expectations about having strategic level discussions, but they're only being had on the IT side and no one on the business side is particularly looking for that, that can be a pretty hard uphill climb for any CIO. Yeah. I mean, I remember years ago at one of our events, we've been talking about strategic role of the CIO probably for the last 10 years, maybe longer. And some CIOs would say, in my industry, that may never happen because of the way IT is viewed and the function that it plays. But it's harder and harder, I think, these days to find industries where technology and technology-enabled capabilities are not a centerpiece of how the business makes its money. Yeah. Let me, when we look ahead into 2019 and 2020, what is the focus for you as the CIO and all these other duties you do when you look at the technologies and the business issues that have the biggest share of your mind right now? What are you thinking about these days?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one challenge I've got is that everywhere needs something, right? I mean, it doesn't matter what we've done. Everywhere needs something. It's very broad. But if I look at where I'm personally spending my time thinking and talking with folks, analytics, I think, is number one. We're making a big investment in analytics. We're adding, 16 positions to the analytics team. And so if you look at an organization our size, it's a big bet. And 3 of those are data scientists. In that area. So that is, we've done a lot of work on kind of the look back world of analytics, the playback side, now it's predictive and I just see an insatiable demand on that side. It doesn't matter what part of the business unit, not just the sales and marketing, but our supply chain, which has traditionally not had a lot of that that ecosystem put around them. So analytics would be a big one. We have a big move that we have to do. Believe it or not, you mentioned the upgrade of our ERP. Well, we have to make a major move. We're a SAP customer, and we'll be moving to the S4 Fashion product line, which is a kind of a re-implementation. And we're expecting to do that by 2020 probably. We have continued expansion of our direct-to-consumer business in Europe. That will continue. And then we'll look to move beyond that, Canada and Asia at some point. We're also looking to see how do we help our retail partners. So a large amount of our revenue is derived through relationships with retailers, and how do we help them compete out there in the marketplace? So we're looking at how do we deliver endless aisle capability so that they can retail products that they may not be carrying directly in the store. We're spending time on the AI space. We see bots and then supply chain. I think in general in the supply chain space, for us a big challenge would be on inventory management as we look across really vastly different. Even though we're selling a similar, we're selling the same product, vastly different markets, whether it's our wholesale market, our direct-to-consumer market, or that industrial business-to-business market I talked about. They all have very different requirements in terms of service levels, and how do we manage that inventory across that space without rocketing the size of that inventory.
Well, and that does seem to be one of the kind of the final frontiers with digital transformation for a lot of companies. There's a certain amount of it you can do inside and upgrading for digital technologies in various areas, but then you get into your supply chain and all of a sudden, at some point in that pipe, you run into manual processes and things being done on clipboards and paper. Describe a little bit about Carhartt's supply chain and where you see the greatest opportunities for digitization.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's obviously, we manufacture our own products as well. So, and we have source partners. The challenge for us is how do we help our own shop floor, and we're going to do that. We're going to put in technology this year, in fact, to be able to understand what's actually happening on the floor. Today, it's a ticket-based, paper-based system on the sewing floor. So we will do that. I do see the focus, though, being on how do we link up that consumer demand or our customer demand and tie that tightly together so that our supply chain, whether it's our own internal manufacturing or our source partners, can better react to those market conditions and smooth it out and not have it be so choppy in terms of, 1 month it's this kind of demand, next month it's another demand, and in this space that's very not only difficult to do, but it can be more expensive to do if you have a very choppy forecast.
Okay.
So that for us is probably our big focus. The other one would be we've started to do 3D tools in our own product development side. So we've got a few in place where we will use that to digitize the development of the product. What we want to do then is how do we move that down to our partners or sourcing partners so that if they're doing some kind of co-development work with us, that they're able to do the same work and do that. Frankly, they're probably farther ahead because of their business on doing some of that 3D modeling. But the 3D modeling does a number of things. One, it reduces your time to market tremendously because you're reducing your need for samples. Okay. And then it helps us on the back end. If you've digitized something already, when we go to put it online for sale, or we provide that images to a customer to put on their own website, they've got much richer experience to be able to show the consumer.
Oh, interesting. Well, and you mentioned how you've got 3 data scientists on staff right now.
Well, we're going to hire them.
You're going to hire them.
Position,
so I was going to say.
Anybody out there is a data scientist, let me know.
Yeah, because you're in Dearborn, Michigan, correct? Yes. I was sitting here wondering what the market. Well, what is the IT hiring market like in Dearborn, Michigan? How do you? I know you don't have a great deal of turnover. You said your attrition's about 15%.
It's actually internally it's less. Internally,
okay.
That's our offshore is only 15%.
Oh, okay.
And but onshore we're less than 5% attrition.
Okay.
The two things. I mean, obviously, I think everywhere the IT market is pretty strong. So I don't think it's.
I visit a lot of cities where the IT unemployment is like 0%.
Yeah. I think what's important is, do you have a brand and do you have a place that people want to come work?
Okay.
And do you have a culture that drives that? And people come here and people love working here, and that certainly helps us in terms of reputation in the marketplace. So, I've certainly been able to bring in folks, from other companies as direct reports from very large companies to come work here. But even like for the data scientists, I believe that we can offer them an experience that they couldn't necessarily get at a larger company. I'm looking at putting these data scientists sitting with the senior executives, sitting with their leadership teams. There is nowhere else that they're probably going to get that type of exposure and interaction. And, we've even, it was funny, we just did a session on that with the senior executive committee yesterday. And that's what we talked about. Well, hey, we might hire folks right out of master's programs or PhD programs with no business experience, but they're going to sit on your leadership team. And like I said, I think that's going to help us recruit people.
Yeah. Well, and they're also, one of the things CIOs have told me when they bring in, especially when there's an emphasis on bringing in millennial developers and millennial data scientists, that they're not aware of any of the corporate blockades that might be in place. There's a lot, they don't have the not invented here syndrome, which tends to infuse new thinking in the team regardless of what the topic is. Well, when you you restructured and added the 16 positions in analytics, do you have any accomplishments, things you're proud of that you can point to that Carhartt's been able to do with that new emphasis on analytics in just, say, the past year?
Well, I mean, the thing is that we just got that approval for the 16 positions, at the end of the year. So it's a big budget increase for this year.
Yeah.
I was able to hire in somebody that we said, not only did they take over the traditional analytics, but they're responsible for all data for the company. So they're in charge of data strategy. They've got the business side of the analytics with the data scientists. And so I think number one was getting an agreement that that's how we're going to work as a company and break down the silos that could exist in the data world especially. But we spent a lot of time cleaning up I'd say the plumbing. We put in a master data management system last year. There was no MDM. We being able to see a consumer no matter how they're interacting with us, whether it's in the store, whether it's online. So that was a big push. And then we started to shift away from a report-centric world and move to a dashboard-centric world with Power BI. So if I look at, kind of the key thing was getting that strategy in place, changing the culture around how we want to consume the data, and then fixing the plumbing. A good example is MDM, but there's others. And that'll continue. There'll be a big push on, like I said, that upfront engagement with the business colleagues. But we will spend a lot more money on whether it's big data, whether it's geographic information, type of layer strategies. So there'll be a lot in the plumbing side as well.
Well, one of the things I've found is so unique about the CIO position. There are functional pieces of it, there are transformational pieces, and there are strategic pieces. And you don't get to just move from one to the other. It's not like you get the foundation in place and everything is fine and then you can ignore it and move on to do transformational work and then it's digital work. And, you pretty much have to be all over the spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Tell me about retailers often seem to have, I think, the toughest road of anybody. It's such a competitive industry. The margins are often razor thin. How is Carhartt doing in the broader context of today's retail market and just the difficulty of hanging on to consumers because there's so many choices?
Yeah. We're doing well. I mean,
I know it's a private company.
But our core consumers, do love the brand. We are relentlessly focused on that, and we manage growth to make sure that we don't dilute the brand and we don't lose focus of why we exist. We have 129 years of history, and the owner, and he's like I said, he's relentlessly focused on that brand. So we do very well in the marketplace. We have a customer set when I talk about those retailers who are very loyal to us as well, and ultimately we aim to make sure that if they're successful, we're successful, and good news, I think it's always good, I think, in this industry to have an authentic brand. Yeah. And the folks that if you talk to have an authentic brand, they're probably doing well right now.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Now, you'd mentioned those three business areas that Carhartt is in: direct to consumer, wholesale, and then in the industrial. And you mentioned that the market is ripe for innovation. I think you were talking about the industrial piece of it. Right. So I just wanted you to, what makes one part of your market more ripe for innovation than others?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a couple of things. We saw that we were underrepresented in that marketplace, even though it was the same product, it was the same consumer, right? That was their employer, though, was buying the stuff to uniform them. So we saw there was a huge opportunity that we were just underrepresented. Okay. So we started digging into that marketplace. We saw there were a lot of challenges in terms of just, lack of even digitization in that process. There's a lot of paper involved, believe it or not, in the uniform business. There's a lot of opaque opaqueness. I guess that's a word, opaqueness. I don't know.
I think it's opacity, actually,
yeah.
But
in terms of understanding what's possible, and so we see that there's a great opportunity because that end worker, wants our product. So how do we help their employer be able to clothe them in Carhartt? And at the end of the day, if you go back to our mission is to protect those employees. And we think there's a ton of opportunity in that space, not to get in specific details of what we're going to do, but we think there's a ton of opportunity to serve that industry and help do more for, frankly, the same amount of money they're spending already.
And are there particular parts of the areas in IT that you've been transforming? Are there particular parts of it that apply directly to that? Getting in and with some of that innovation. I'm thinking about your ERP upgrade was probably significant in that.
I think all kind of end to end, if you think about it, whether it's data, to understand our website, we have built functionality which is meant to be able to serve that market, be able to provide workflow type of activities. We see, there's obviously a ton more that needs to get done to go after that space, but it really still rests on the core, I call it infrastructure of Carhartt, to deliver products. So everything we've done, like I said, whether it's the PLM, the product lifecycle management system we put in, or the ERP work or website, all of those things are going to help support that marketplace.
Okay. Most companies today are engaging in some version of what gets called digital transformation. And I have actually found that across different industries, it means entirely different things. You can talk to someone in the oil and gas industry, and if you say digital transformation, they look at you a little quizzically, but they say, oh, you mean oil field transformation, and it's something very specific. What do those buzzwords mean at Carhartt? And if I were to ask your president, what would she say?
Yeah, for us, it really is, getting down to it is, frankly, it's digitizing all those business processes end to end. The ultimate goal for us is, to be able to eliminate silos, to make sure that information is flowing across that environment. I talked about some of those challenges of, between, if you think about the front end of your business of sales back to supply chain, to the degree that is interconnected across that is really the ultimate goal. So we're really focused on finishing up that digitization across those. The last space we're doing like I said, the product lifecycle management. We just did our first implementation this year, and we're focused on supply chain next. And that means we'll have every business unit, I'd say, fairly digitized. And people say, well, then you're done. And well, no, then that drives up an ability to continue to drive continuous improvement or innovation opportunities. But only once you get that kind of base environment set across that ecosystem can you really garner, I would say, game changer type of opportunities. Very difficult if you don't have that interconnected, across your ecosystem.
Okay. Well, one of the things I always like to talk to CIOs about is how they approach innovation, just as a leadership topic, as a very practical matter of how it's structured within the company. Some companies take a pretty informal approach to it. Others have something much more structured and formal. How have you been approaching IT innovation since you arrived at Carhartt?
Yeah. So, if you remember, that was one of my three topics at the beginning. Besides leadership and time to market, the other one was innovation. How do we create innovation? So what we did first was I just asked the team, listen, let's get pilots going. Figure out how you can get team members to start coming up with things, no rules, just come up with ideas. And so we implemented a Shark Tank process. Okay. So folks came up with their ideas. There's a committee then that said, yes, come forward. And then they pitched it. They built something and pitched it to really the judges would usually be myself and one of the business execs. And that was great. We did that for the first, year and a bit. And but what we found is that we got a lot of continuous improvement type of opportunities, and a number of those went to production afterwards. But we weren't getting game changers, and we weren't getting people to try things that they didn't have experience with.
Yeah.
And I really felt that was the only way we were going to get a true innovation culture, is to take it to another level. So we then late last year changed it to an innovation challenge. And we decided to set aside 5% of IT time during the year to work on innovation. So I know a lot of CIOs will say 5%. How did you?
Yeah, how do you measure that?
I said we set aside one Friday a month.
Okay.
And we said that Friday there's no project work. I mean, other than if we have a system down type of issue or something like that, people are freed up to work on innovation projects. But we didn't force everybody to do it. We said, who wants to volunteer to participate? We had, I would say, between 50 and 60 people sign up in Q4s, for example. And then there were 9 teams that were all then working. I came up with the 9 topics, and I said, okay, here you are. So some of the examples of things that were built. We had a product kind of search bot in Facebook Messenger. Yeah. That was built. And that was, like I said, this was built in 1 quarter. And it was a live working prototype. We had another bot for customer service. We had a way to do location-based targeting. We were working on one, it's not done yet, to do 3D scanning. In other words, create your own avatar. So then if you think about it, you could try on clothes online. Remember I talked about the 3D modeling we're doing?
Yeah.
We could actually, not only could you try the clothes on, but you could see an X-ray view to see how it would fit on you. So where is it tight? Where is it loose? Not just how it looks on you, but how it fits. We had a digital boardroom. We had translation. So we had these projects. And out of the 9 teams, 5 or 6 then pitched it at the end. So they spent 3 days. And then we had 4 members of the executive committee that came in and spent a few hours judging the teams. And it was a great result. I mean, obviously, all of the teams played with technology that they had no experience with.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting aspect of it. You didn't want your people who were already familiar with mobile development to be developing some new mobile innovation. You made them go work on something else.
Yeah. And really it was to just start opening up, the aperture and get people to start thinking about things differently. So the person who runs it for me is my head of planning and architecture. Okay. So, she runs the process of saying, okay, here's for the first couple quarters, I'm the one who came up with the topics.
Yeah.
And then she then slots people to those teams. They don't get to volunteer for what project they want to work on. She slots them based on trying to create cross-functional groups, but also to get people on things that maybe they don't have experience with. And it was good to the first quarter. We also made sure that every member of my leadership team, including myself, worked on a project. So we were on a project as well, leading, working with their team. So a little bit of competitiveness also helped as well to get the juices flowing.
How did you come up with the 9 topics? Was this something, had it been on your to-do list for a while, or?
Yeah, just kind of things that came up in various meetings. I'll be thinking, so I'm driving home, driving to work, whatever it might be. Hey, we should really do something like this. And all of those were things that I saw we had some kind of a business capability gap in an area. Okay. And say, okay, how can we go find something that might fill that gap? We don't know what it is yet. And frankly, all of the ones, we didn't tell them what technology to use. We said, here is the solution we want you to go build. Go find the technology you want to use and go build it. Yeah. And we spent $0 doing it.
Now, that's an interesting piece of it, because a lot of times innovation efforts have some percentage of budget or some kind of funding to it. And you did the $0 that you spent on it was due to supplier relationships.
Right.
Talk a little bit more about that, because I think sometimes that's an overlooked area. In fact, you said that it's overlooked by a lot of CIOs, how much more involvement they can get out of their vendor partners.
Yeah. I would say even Carhartt was probably the same thing. They traditionally had treated suppliers like vendors, right? I think everybody calls them a vendor, and I say, well, that's vendor is like the hot dog guy, right? That's the vendor. But at the end of the day, they're interested in making sure that we continue to grow and get the most out of the technology.
Sure.
And they're interested in creating market opportunities for their products. And so we do build, now we have very, strategic relationships, whether it's IBM or a Microsoft or an SAP or a Cisco. And our strategy, even on new projects, is we pretty much go to them first. We look to them and say, can you do this first before we even go to look at other potential suppliers? That's our kind of trade-off on this is you work with us and then we'll make sure that we're trying to leverage those relationships. But I took my whole leadership team, for example, on a West Coast supplier visit. We went out and spent time with each of our strategic suppliers out there. So we spent a whole day with them and understand not just what we're interested in, but what are they working on that they think we might be interested in. IBM, for example, runs workshops here 4 times a year as part of our relationship. And we can pick a business topic, and they'll come in and run the workshop for a whole day, including with my peers in the room about this is how we might be able to attack a particular challenge. So they're actually going to run one on that industrial space with us here in a couple of weeks.
And are you mainly asking them to bring expertise in a consulting sense, or do you look for other kinds of resources?
It depends, frankly. We might be looking for, like I said, particular expertise. We might be looking for ability to try things out, for free before we do anything. We're looking for thought leadership, even from a business process standpoint, experience that they may have with other customers that they can help share and that we can learn from. So there's a wide range of those things. But I think it's important to realize that it has to go both ways. So if any of those partnerships, like I said, we've got the thing, which is we engage with them first in opportunities. But the other one is that, I've done a number of things with several of those suppliers in terms of speaking and other activities. But that's my, commitment back to them. If they're a good partner to us, then, we'll do the same to help them out.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, too, sometimes whether mid-market size companies even realize that they can ask this of their various partners and suppliers. You don't have to be a Fortune 10 or a Fortune 50 company to get this kind of attention.
Yeah. I will admit that it's helpful to have the Carhartt brand.
Yeah. All right. You have a good brand. Exactly.
It's helpful to have a brand.
A recognizable brand.
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's, obviously, and it's helpful that, we're trying to drive innovation and do those things because there's a lot of good stories around that. But even, I was at an insurance company, which wasn't a brand, and we were able to get the same type of experience. So I do think it comes down to, the relationship that the CIO and their executive IT team and how they're going to treat those relationships, how they treat those suppliers. And it doesn't mean we're a pushover when it comes to negotiations. Right. But at the same time, we're trying to grow for the long term with them.
Yeah. Well, I think, and that's something that I see when CIOs move up through functional to transformational to a strategic level, they do tend to have these more strategic relationships with their partners. They just look at them differently and they demand different things from them.
Yeah.
You wrote an interesting blog a few months ago, I think back in November, about overcoming the obstacles to innovation. So I want to talk a little bit about those. You identified 4 of them. The first one was agile development itself and how it can get a little overwhelming for the teams just in terms of the stream of work that is constantly flowing through. Yeah. And it never ends because there's the MVPs to create and new cycles that are starting. So talk about that first obstacle to innovation and how you try to get over it.
Right. Yeah, I think the key thing, as you mentioned, is a lot of people think that in and itself, agile drives innovation, but all it drives is a backlog.
Yeah.
So
it's a lot of work.
You're just going to get faster at delivering the backlog.
Yeah.
So the big thing is that you have to figure out how to create capacity for innovation, whether it's time in sprints or whether it's like we did in terms of set aside a Friday. The premise of being agile, like I said, is not necessarily about innovation. In itself, though, being agile can help you be more innovative because you can try things at a faster pace, but it won't free up time to truly get game changers necessarily because the product owner may not prioritize those type of activities.
That's right. They're actually focused on the product they're working on.
Right.
So the innovation essentially has to be earlier in the process before the agile. The second one was budget. And of course, we already talked about that a little bit. Your advice is get your suppliers in the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
And even so, somebody will say, I'm public sector. I've had people say, I'm public sector and I can't do that. And it's not true. For example, the insurance company I mentioned was public sector. Yeah. And but we had a rule that said we did the proof of concepts and they were a $0 purchase order type of thing with them. But what we said is that anytime all they're doing is creating a market opportunity, everything would go out for RFP. Right. If we came down to the actual, like, we want to do something in this space. Yeah. So, I don't think you have to be private sector to be able to have those supplier relationships.
That's a great point to make. Good. I'm glad you mentioned that. Your third obstacle was just human nature, the team excitement. It's a bell curve, right? Everybody gets all excited at first, and then it starts to get a little more. I heard one CIO talk about it as the trough of despair. How everybody's very excited in the beginning, and then the work really starts, and then they realize that they're already behind, and then they get a little despairing. So what do you do when team excitement starts to peak out a little bit?
Yeah. I think there's two things right in there. One is the extra work. Sometimes people see it as just extra work. Yeah. And you really do need to make sure that you're slotting off time for them, but also make it fun. If it's not fun, and this is, and I also think sometimes people put too much structure around it. We have no standard operating procedures on this. There's no process. There's no nothing. Okay. It is really just, hey, here's the idea. Let's go. Yep. And be fun about it. We joke about it. And the other thing is there's, by definition, no innovation project can go to production. It gets thrown out. You have to start over and do it the right way because we don't worry about security. We don't worry about any of those things.
That's an interesting point. Yeah.
It's just about learning. The whole focus of our innovation effort is about learning. It is not a pilot. And I think sometimes people get those confused. Okay. Because a pilot means that it goes to production if it's successful. So that puts a lot more rigor on things. Yeah. Security, all the overhead. So for me, it's keep it loose, keep it fun, keep it about learning. Yeah. And there'll always be in an organization, some people want to do it and some that don't. And like I said, in mine, I'd say it's half that people are like, yes, I want to be in. Yeah. The other half, okay, I prefer not to. And that's fantastic.
One CIO referred to that to me as the rule of thirds. He said, anytime you introduce something new, there'll be a third of your people that are super excited. A third of the people are doing a little bit of watch and see, and maybe I'll get involved. And then a third of them not interested.
Yeah, and when it stalls out, next time, same thing on innovation, try something different like we did with moving from the Shark Tank to the Innovation Challenge, for example. Yes. Put a different spin on it now. Try, to reinvigorate it just like anything else.
Well, and that's your fourth obstacle, that things get stalled.
Right.
Yeah. And there you've got the Friday time that you carved out and so forth. Okay, we're getting near the top of our hour here. So I guess my last question for you is about the CIO role itself. It's always fun to talk about it because it seems to be in a constant state of evolution. But you said some interesting things about that. One is you said, because I asked about what did you think would happen with like the CIO title in going into the future, and I think your response was something like titles don't really matter. So talk about how you see the role evolving, whatever we're going to call it, in the future.
Yeah, I think in the future you may have somebody responsible for technology, but they're probably also responsible for something else. It may be similar to my role. And so whatever they call it, I don't know. Like my role is CIO, but I didn't change it to be CIO and head of planning and pricing and, all
you
of those
didn't add
things.
another line to your business card.
Yeah. So, but I think because it is so integrated in terms of the business now that I do think there is going to be more and more where somebody, on the executive committee has got two hats. It's got the oversee of the technology, but it's embedded, kind of in everything everybody does to make sure that there's consistency, but also, it's one of the business processes so that they have a better feel for, is that technology really working? Is it really, providing the value? So if I don't, maybe I'm wrong, but that's my 2 cents on it anyway.
Yeah. Well, I've had some CIOs recently that I spoke with who are more and more interested in the chief operating officer role and how that is changing. And that our focus is all around CIOs here. So I don't really get to talk to that many COOs. But the point that they're making is that the operation of the company is so tied into all the different digital technologies and various technology tools and so forth that there's a likelihood over the next few years that the COO role may come to include technology.
It may very well, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let me see. I guess I did have one penultimate final question. Your reading habits. How do you stay on top of, you mentioned that you read the Wall Street Journal. How do you stay on top of the market, technology, and business trends? What do you recommend?
I think, today's world, with whether it's your Twitter feed or your LinkedIn feed or, whatever it might be, even my Google feed, it's coming from everywhere, fast and furious. So, starting the day on a wide range of topics is important for me.
Yeah.
But the supplier relationships is where I get a lot as well. I do a lot of executive briefings with them. I do spend time and go to, for example, IBM Think, I think sometimes CIOs don't do that, and I still try to do that and learn a little bit about the technology itself. I'd like to say I'm really self-actualized and that's all I do, but when I drive to work or I ride home from work, I'm not thinking about technology. I listen to ESPN radio in the morning. I listen to Comedy Channel on the way back. So
good.
You
like to keep a foot in real life.
I think I try to keep it balanced in my life. So, but I think the relationships and the team members, even like folks in my team come with, hey, we'd like to talk about this. So I learn a lot just from all those interactions as well.
Yep. Well, sometimes listening can be the most important skill we use.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
And it's been a real pleasure listening to you today, John. So thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. And I'll be talking to you again soon, I hope.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. And thank you all. Thanks to our audience for joining us today. This was a conversation with John Hill, the CIO at Carhartt, rugged wear, rugged workwear for men, women, and children. And we will be back with another episode of CIO Leadership Live on March 8th, when I'll be talking with Majgan Lefebvre, who is the CIO of the global specialty business at Liberty Mutual. And in the meantime, if you're just tuning in and catching the very last of this episode, we do put the video will be up tomorrow on CIO.com. And we also produce an audio podcast that we post to iTunes, Google Play, and SoundCloud. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.